Arrogant principal expelled a quiet black student. Then one envelope silenced the entire school. The hallway was packed. Students pressed against lockers, phones half raised, teachers standing frozen in doorways they normally never left open. And in the middle of all of it stood a man who liked being watched. He straightened his tie. He looked around to make sure enough people were listening. And then, in a voice loud enough to bounce off every locker in that corridor, he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "You're expelled. Leave this school immediately." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The boy standing in front of him didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply nodded, the way someone nods when they already knew this moment was coming long before it arrived. Then he reached into his bag, pulled out a single sealed envelope, and placed it gently on the principal's desk. "Please read this after I'm gone," he said quietly. That was it, no pleading, no excuses, no tears. The principal looked down at the envelope like it was a piece of trash someone had dropped on his desk by accident. He almost laughed. He picked it up, tossed it carelessly onto a pile of paperwork, and turned back to the crowd of students like he'd just won something. The boy walked away. He didn't look back once. And if you think that's where this story ends, stay with me, because less than 1 hour later, that same principal, a man who feared absolutely nothing, who had built his entire career on control and intimidation, would be standing in front of the whole school, unable to say a single word. What was inside that envelope? And why did it silence a man who never once in 15 years had been silenced by anyone? Stay until the end, because the answer to that question is not what you think, and it changes everything you're about to see. Now let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about who this boy actually was, because almost nobody in that building actually knew. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of student anyone pointed out in a crowd. He kept his head down, his grades near perfect, and his opinions to himself. Teachers described him the same way, almost word for word, quiet, respectful, never a single problem. He helped clean up the classroom without being asked. He carried books for a girl in a wheelchair every single morning without anyone requesting it. During lunch, while other students huddled in groups laughing over their phones, he sat alone with a book, occasionally glancing up just long enough to notice things other people missed. And here's the strange part. Despite being one of the best students in that entire school, almost nobody could tell you anything real about him, not where he lived, not what his family did, not why he never brought friends home. He was, in every sense of the word, invisible. Which makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why does someone that good at everything work so hard to stay unnoticed? Keep that question in your mind, because it matters more than you think. Every afternoon, the moment the final bell rang, he'd slip out a side door most students didn't even know existed, walk 2 blocks and call his grandmother from a payphone outside a corner store, because his own phone had been broken for months and he never once complained about it. He'd ask her how her knees were doing. He'd remind her to take her medication. And every single day, without fail, he'd tell her the same thing before hanging up. "I'm taking care of everything, Grandma, don't worry." Nobody at that school knew about those calls. Nobody knew about the cafeteria workers he quietly helped clean up after hours. Nobody knew he'd been paying off other students' lunch debts anonymously for over a year, using money he earned from a part-time job most people didn't even know he had. He kept a small notebook tucked in the front pocket of his backpack, the pages worn soft at the corners from constant use. Nobody ever saw what he wrote in it. Some assumed it was homework. Others assumed it was nothing at all. But every so often between classes, he'd pull it out, jot something down quickly, and slide it away before anyone could ask. There was also a substitute teacher who had been filling in for a few weeks that semester, a woman new to the school who didn't yet know the unspoken rules of who to pay attention to and who to ignore. She noticed things the full-time staff had long stopped noticing. She noticed how he always arrived early enough to help set up the classroom before anyone else walked in. She noticed how he never once asked for extra credit, despite clearly deserving it. And quietly, without telling anyone why, she started keeping her own written notes about him, tucked inside her lesson planner where nobody would think to look. Why would a substitute teacher, someone with no history at this school, feel the need to secretly document a student's behavior? That's a question worth sitting with, because the answer arrives later, and it matters more than you'd expect. Meanwhile, the principal of that school built his entire reputation on the opposite philosophy. Discipline first. Respect earned through fear. He believed kindness was weakness dressed up in nicer clothing, and more than one teacher in that building quietly disagreed with him behind closed doors, but nobody, not once, had the courage to challenge him to his face. There was only one person in that entire school who seemed to see something the rest of them didn't. The janitor, an older man, gray-haired, the kind of person students walked past 1,000 times without ever really looking at. Every single morning as the boy walked through the front doors, the janitor would pause his mopping just long enough to watch him pass. And every single morning he'd smile, just slightly, like he knew something nobody else in that building had figured out yet. He never explained why. Not yet, anyway. Weeks passed like this. Ordinary, quiet, unremarkable to anyone not paying close attention. But if you looked closely enough, the way that janitor did, the way that substitute teacher did, you would have noticed something building underneath the surface of that school, like pressure gathering before a storm nobody else could see coming yet. Now here's where things start to unravel, because good people rarely stay safe for long in places run by fear. School property went missing. Supplies from a locked storage closet. Nothing was seen. No cameras caught anything conclusive. But somebody somewhere whispered a name into the wrong ear, and that name spread through the hallway faster than any truth ever could. His name. No evidence, no proof, just a rumor with enough weight behind it to make people believe it simply because it was easier than asking questions. Students who used to nod at him in the hallway suddenly looked away. Teachers who once praised his work started watching him differently, like they were reevaluating everything they thought they knew. And the principal, a man who prided himself on swift judgment, didn't hesitate for even a second. He believed it immediately. Which brings up something worth asking. If you were accused of something you didn't do and you had every reason in the world to defend yourself, why would you stay silent instead? That's exactly what this boy did, and it made absolutely no sense to anyone watching, until later, because later everything about that silence would make perfect sense. Even the school's secretary, a woman who had worked in that front office for over a decade and had seen every kind of student pass through those doors, found herself unable to focus on her paperwork that day. She kept glancing toward the hallway, toward the office door, her hands unsteady in a way her coworkers had never seen before. When another staff member asked if she was all right, she simply shook her head and said she had a bad feeling about how this was being handled. Nobody asked her to explain further. Nobody realized, not yet, just how much she already understood about what was really happening behind the scenes. The principal called him into the office, not privately, not the way any reasonable adult would handle an unproven accusation involving a minor. He called him in front of teachers, in front of staff, in front of parents who happened to be there for an entirely unrelated meeting. A room full of adults watching a teenage boy be humiliated in public before a single fact had been confirmed. "Students like you don't belong here," the principal said, loud enough for the hallway outside to hear every word. Silence swallowed the room. The boy didn't argue, he didn't cry, he didn't defend himself even once. He simply looked at the man in front of him and said 4 words. "I understand," he said. That was it. And if you've ever watched someone get judged before the truth had a chance to catch up, you already know how heavy that kind of silence can feel. It's the kind of moment that stays with you. So tell me honestly, down in the comments, has something like that ever happened to you or to someone you love? Because stories like this one exist for a reason, to remind us that fairness isn't something we should ever take for granted. Now let's keep going, because what happens next is where everything starts to change. The paperwork was signed within the hour. No investigation, no second opinion, no hesitation. Security walked him out through the front doors while students lined the hallway to watch. Some laughed, the way teenagers do when they don't fully understand the weight of what they're witnessing. Some looked away, ashamed without knowing exactly why. One teacher, a woman who had taught him for 2 years, stood frozen near her classroom door with tears in her eyes, saying absolutely nothing because she knew nothing she said would change the outcome. Before he stepped through those doors for what everyone assumed was the last time, he turned around one final time. He looked directly at the principal, reached into his bag, and placed one more sealed envelope onto the front desk. "Please wait until I'm gone," he said softly. The principal actually laughed this time. A short, dismissive laugh, the kind reserved for people who believe they've already won. He picked up the envelope, tossed it onto a stack of files without a second thought, and turned back toward his office like the matter was already settled. But here's something worth noticing. While every camera and every set of eyes in that hallway followed the boy walking out the door, the story wasn't following him anymore. It was following the envelope, sitting there unopened, forgotten, waiting. Because sometimes, the most important thing in the entire room is the one thing nobody bothers to look at. Hours passed. The school day continued as if nothing unusual had happened. And then, without warning, without explanation, a series of unexpected visitors began arriving at the front office. District officials, members of the school board, a woman in a formal gray suit who introduced herself only as legal counsel, and finally, someone almost nobody recognized at first glance, a man who used to run this very school years before the current principal ever took the position. Nobody explained why they were there. And for the first time in 15 years, the principal, a man who had never once shown discomfort in front of staff, began to look nervous. What exactly was happening? Who called them? And why now of all moments? Keep that question close, because the answer is coming, and it's bigger than anyone in that building expected. While the office buzzed with quiet tension, something else started happening in the hallways. Teachers, one after another, quietly began speaking up. He never missed a single class, one said, not once in 3 years. He never received a single detention, said another. He organized a food drive for 3 families last winter, a cafeteria worker admitted. He never told anyone it was him. I only found out by accident. He paid off my daughter's lunch account for 4 months, another parent whispered. We didn't even know until the school called to ask why the balance suddenly disappeared. He used to sit with the new kids at lunch, a younger teacher added. The ones who didn't know anybody yet, every single year without being asked. He never once complained, said the janitor, finally speaking up in front of others for the first time. Not about anything, not even the day his shoes fell apart in the middle of winter and he kept wearing them anyway rather than ask for help. The substitute teacher stepped forward too, holding the lesson planner she had quietly filled with observations over the past few weeks. She read a few lines aloud, small, ordinary kindnesses she had written down simply because they moved her, never expecting they would matter beyond her own private notes. The room grew quieter with every sentence. One truth after another began surfacing, and with every single one, the same realization settled over that building like a slow, heavy fog. Nobody had actually known this boy at all. And then came the moment that changed the tone of everything. Security footage was pulled from the storage closet, reviewed carefully by staff who, for the first time, actually bothered to check the facts before assuming guilt. The footage proved it clearly. He had never taken anything. But here's the thing, as important as that reveal was, it still wasn't the biggest twist waiting inside this story. When the principal was informed the footage cleared him completely, he barely reacted. He shrugged. So what? He said, as if a boy's entire reputation, his education, his future meant absolutely nothing next to his own pride. At that exact moment, the school's secretary, a woman who had stayed unusually quiet through the entire ordeal, walked into the room holding something everyone had completely forgotten about. The envelope. She placed it gently on the table in front of everyone. Nobody in that room knew what was inside, but something about the way she set it down, carefully, almost reverently, told everyone watching that this was the moment the entire story had been building toward. If you're still here with me, you are about to witness the exact moment that changed an entire school forever. So stay close, because what happens next is the reason this story is being told at all. The principal reached for the envelope with visibly shaking hands. He tore it open slowly, and the room fell into complete silence. No whispers, no movement, just the sound of paper sliding against paper as he pulled out what was inside. Official documents, a handwritten letter folded neatly, a handful of old photographs, slightly worn at the edges, recommendation letters bearing signatures from people far more important than anyone in that room expected, and finally, formal authorization papers bearing the seal of the school district itself. His face changed. Not gradually, instantly. Whatever he was reading, it was clearly not what he expected. But even now, the full picture still hadn't come together. because what he was holding in his hands wasn't just paperwork. It was an entire history nobody in that school had ever known. Years earlier, long before this boy ever stepped foot in that building, his late grandfather had quietly donated a significant portion of land to the district, land that eventually made the school's entire expansion possible. No press conference, no plaque with his name on it, no public recognition of any kind. The family had asked for nothing in return, and the story had faded quietly into the background of district history, forgotten by almost everyone except the people who signed the original paperwork. More recently, his grandmother, the same woman he called every single afternoon from that payphone outside the corner store, had established a private scholarship fund for underprivileged students across the district, funded quietly through her own modest savings, asking that her name never be attached publicly to any of it. And the boy himself, this quiet, invisible teenager that an entire school had just humiliated and expelled without a single shred of evidence, had been personally working alongside the district for the past year on a new mentorship initiative, designed specifically to help struggling students in underfunded schools just like this one. The envelope contained proof of every false accusation made against him, a legal notice from the district, documentation of everything his family had quietly contributed over the years without asking for recognition, confirmation that investigators had already been reviewing multiple complaints filed against this very principal long before today's events ever took place. And finally, a letter, handwritten in the boy's own words, asking for something nobody in that room expected. Not revenge. Fairness, not just for himself, but for every student who would ever walk through those doors after him. There was more in that letter, too. He wrote about his grandmother's hands, worn from decades of factory work, and how she had never once complained about a single ache even as her health slowly declined. He wrote about the promise he'd made to his late grandfather, years before he passed, to never use the family name as a shortcut for anything in life, to earn every single thing on his own, quietly, without ever expecting credit. He wrote about how he had known for weeks that the accusations against him were false, and how he had considered defending himself loudly, publicly, the way anyone would expect. But he chose silence instead because he wanted to see, once and for all, whether this school valued truth on its own merit, or only when it was forced into the open by proof nobody could deny. The room stayed completely silent for a long moment, because in that instant the entire story shifted. This was never about status or land or money or connections. It was about character, about integrity that never once needed an audience to prove itself. Teachers who had doubted him began quietly crying. Parents who had judged him days earlier stood frozen in shame. Students who had laughed while he walked out those doors now stared at the floor, unable to meet each other's eyes. Even the school board members, people who had walked into that room expecting a routine disciplinary review, found themselves quietly wiping their eyes. One of them, an older woman who had sat on that board for over 20 years, later admitted this was the first time in her entire career she had seen a room full of adults humbled by a teenager's quiet integrity. And the principal, a man who built his entire identity around control and dominance, stood there completely speechless, holding proof of everything he had destroyed in a matter of hours, with absolutely nothing left to say. Because the quietest person in that entire building had spent years quietly protecting the very institution that had just thrown him away, and he did it without ever once asking for credit. The school board wasted no time. Within days, the principal was formally removed from his position, pending a full investigation into years of complaints that had apparently been ignored for far too long. The expulsion was reversed immediately. A public apology followed, delivered in front of the very same students and staff who had witnessed his humiliation weeks earlier. And when he was finally invited back to speak, this quiet boy who had every right in the world to demand an apology, to demand recognition, to demand anything at all, simply thanked everyone for their time. And then he asked for one thing only: that every student who walked through those doors after him be treated fairly, regardless of how loud or quiet they happened to be. The room rose to its feet. The secretary, still standing near the table where she had placed the envelope earlier, finally allowed herself to exhale. She had known pieces of this story for longer than anyone realized. She had processed some of the district paperwork herself months earlier without fully understanding what it meant at the time. She never said a word about it publicly. She didn't need to. Watching the truth finally reach the people who needed to hear it was enough for her. Because sometimes, the strongest people in the room are the ones who never once feel the need to prove it. Character rarely announces itself. It doesn't walk into a room demanding attention. It doesn't need applause to feel complete. More often than not, the strongest people you'll ever meet are the quiet ones, the ones who never feel the need to convince anyone of who they are, because they already know. The boy went on to finish his final year at that school with the quiet dignity he'd carried the whole time, never once bringing up the humiliation he'd endured, never once holding it over anyone who had doubted him. He graduated with the same grades he'd always earned, accepted a scholarship he'd worked for entirely on his own, and continued visiting his grandmother every single afternoon, just as he always had, long before any of this began. Weeks later, that school had a new principal, one who understood the difference between discipline and dignity. Students, inspired by everything they had witnessed, started a kindness initiative in the boy's honor, something as simple as helping classmates who were struggling without ever asking for recognition in return. The old janitor, still mopping the same hallways every morning, finally smiled the kind of smile he'd been holding back for years. When a young teacher finally asked him why he always watched that boy so closely, he simply said, "I knew his grandfather many years ago. Greatness runs quietly in that family. Always has." And when that boy walked through the hallway again for the first time since his return, something had changed. Nobody looked past him anymore. Nobody called him invisible. Teachers who once doubted him now greeted him by name every morning and meant it. Students who had laughed on the day of his expulsion found ways, quietly, to apologize, some in words, some simply by finally treating him the way he had always deserved to be treated. And the janitor, still sweeping that same hallway every morning long after most of the staff had changed, would tell anyone who asked that he'd known all along this story wouldn't end the way it started. He just never imagined he'd get to watch it happen with his own eyes. Because sometimes, it takes losing everything for people to finally see what was in front of them the entire time. The substitute teacher, whose temporary assignment had long since ended by the time all of this played out, later said she still kept that old lesson planner in a drawer at home. Every once in a while, she said, she'd open it just to remind herself that paying attention to the quiet ones is never wasted effort. And the notebook the boy always carried, the one nobody had ever seen the inside of, it turned out to be filled with nothing dramatic at all, just names. Every classmate he'd ever quietly helped, every small kindness he'd done and never mentioned, written down not for recognition, but simply so he wouldn't forget who needed him next. If this story reminded you that dignity is something earned through character, not titles or authority, leave a comment below with the word respect, so others scrolling past can see they're not alone in believing that. Share this with someone in your life who still believes that kindness is never weakness, no matter how loud the world gets. And if stories like this one mean something to you, stories where truth eventually finds its way to the surface, where courage is quiet, and where justice arrives not through revenge, but through simple, undeniable proof, stay close, because there are more stories exactly like this one still waiting to be told.